The January night pressed heavily against the small animal shelter in rural Ohio. Rain battered the cracked windows, and the icy wind seeped through every gap in the old building. At the far end of the dimly lit hallway, under a flickering fluorescent light, lay Shadow, a once mighty German shepherd reduced to a frail, aging figure. His muzzle had turned silver with age, scars traced across his left flank, and his deep, tired eyes held a haunting sadness. That night, a sound cut through the shelter's usual stillness, a long, mournful howl that seemed to echo with years of untold pain. Lisa, a young shelter assistant with a soft spot for hard cases, froze mid-step. She had spent weeks watching Shadow barely lift his head, let alone make a sound. While the other dogs barked, whimpered, and paced their cages, Shadow stayed silent, as if he had already accepted his fate. But this howl, deep and sorrowful, was different. It was the cry of a soul that knew its time was running out. Lisa hurried down the hall, her heart pounding, until she reached his cage. Shadow lay on the cold concrete floor, but as Lisa approached, he lifted his head slowly. His amber eyes met hers, and for a moment, she felt a lump rise in her throat. Shadow wasn't just tired, he was broken. She knelt beside the cage, her fingers curling around the bars. "You don't belong here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not like this." Shadow's ears flicked slightly, a small acknowledgement, but he didn't move closer. Lisa had heard Shadow's story when he arrived weeks ago. He wasn't an ordinary stray. For nearly 10 years, he'd been a decorated K-9 officer, working alongside his handler, Officer David Connors. Together, they had saved lives, tracked fugitives, and been celebrated heroes in their city. But nothing lasts forever. Shadow had been forced into retirement after a serious injury during a high-risk operation. David, facing his own challenges, an early retirement and personal struggles, had made the difficult decision to place Shadow in a program meant to rehome retired K-9s. Somewhere along the way, Shadow had fallen through the cracks. Now, he was just another dog in a crowded shelter, waiting for a final decision that Lisa could hardly bear to think about. The next morning, as Lisa arrived for her shift, she saw a man standing in the shelter's front office. Rainwater dripped from his soaked overcoat onto the linoleum floor. His hair was gray, and his face was lined with years of wear, but his eyes burned with determination. Clutched in his hand was a worn envelope. "I'm here for Shadow," the man said, his voice gravelly and filled with emotion. "I'm David Connors. He was my partner, and I need to take him home." Lisa's breath caught in her chest. The man's words carried a weight that couldn't be ignored, but she also knew the clock was ticking. Shadow's fate was all but sealed. Was this reunion too late? Could David convince the shelter to spare the life of the dog who had once been his closest ally? And what secrets did David carry that had kept him away for so long? Lisa's hands trembled as she stared at the man standing before her. David Connors was no stranger to the weight of responsibility. That much was clear from his weathered face and piercing eyes. But there was something else, something unspoken, hanging in the air between them. Shadow had been waiting for this man, that much Lisa knew. Yet, the shelter's policy left little room for exceptions. Dogs on the euthanasia list were given one final day. For Shadow, that day was today. "Why now?" Lisa asked, her voice cracking. "Why wait until the last possible moment?" David lowered his gaze, gripping the edge of the counter tightly. "I didn't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought the program would take care of him. I thought I was doing what was best for him." His words hung in the air, and Lisa felt her frustration mix with empathy. Whatever had kept him away, it was clear David carried the burden of guilt. But guilt wouldn't stop the shelter's policies, and time was running out. Lisa stepped out from behind the counter, her mind racing. "Shadow's in the back," she said, leading David through the narrow hallways of the shelter. The sound of barking and whining dogs filled the air, but David didn't seem to hear any of it. His focus was ahead, his every step quick and deliberate. When they reached Shadow's cage, the German shepherd lay still, his ears barely flicking at their arrival. But as soon as David crouched in front of the bars, Shadow lifted his head. His tired eyes widened, and for the first time in weeks, his tail thumped weakly against the floor. "Hey, buddy," David said softly, his voice trembling. He reached through the bars, and Shadow pressed his head into David's hand, letting out a low, guttural whine. The reunion was heartbreaking, a bittersweet mix of joy and sorrow. Shadow hadn't forgotten his partner. Despite everything, the bond they'd shared still lingered, strong and unbroken. Lisa felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "We don't have much time," she said, her tone urgent. "I'll try to buy us a little more, but you need to convince them. They don't bend the rules easily." David nodded, his jaw tightening. He stood, his shoulders squaring as if he were preparing for battle. But even as he followed Lisa back toward the front office, a shadow of doubt lingered in his expression. Could he really save Shadow? Would the shelter's bureaucracy allow it? Or had he come too late to undo his mistake? David wasn't just fighting for Shadow's life, he was fighting for redemption. As Lisa stepped into the office to make her case, David paused in the hallway, glancing back toward Shadow's cage. He clenched his fists. If this shelter wouldn't help, he'd have to find another way. But would Shadow even survive the wait? Time was running out, and David knew every second counted. Lisa stood in the shelter's cramped office, her palms sweating as she faced the shelter director, a stern woman named Margaret Evans. Margaret was a no-nonsense figure, with a reputation for adhering strictly to policy. Behind her desk, a mountain of paperwork loomed, each file representing an animal in need, and Shadow's was just one among hundreds. "Margaret," Lisa began, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "There's someone here for Shadow, his former handler. He's begging to take him home." Margaret didn't even look up at first, her pen scratching against a clipboard. "Shadow's on the list, Lisa. You know how this works. We don't have the resources to hold onto unadoptable dogs." Lisa swallowed hard, fighting the frustration rising in her chest. "But he's not unadoptable," she pressed. "David Connors is here. Shadow was his partner for years. He's willing to take him back." Margaret paused, finally meeting Lisa's gaze. Her expression softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "I understand your sentiment, but we've been down this road before. Promises are made, paperwork gets tangled, and the animals pay the price. We can't afford another delay." Meanwhile, in the hallway, David stood just outside the office, his fists clenched. Through the thin walls, he could hear the conversation, and his frustration grew with every passing second. Shadow's life wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't about policies or delays. It was about loyalty, something Shadow had shown him every single day of their partnership. Without thinking, David stepped into the office, his presence filling the small room like a storm cloud. "With all due respect," he said, his voice firm but controlled, "Shadow isn't just a dog. He's a hero. He saved lives. And he deserves better than this." Margaret looked up at David, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Connors, I appreciate what Shadow has done, truly. But the reality is, this shelter is overwhelmed. We don't have the luxury of making exceptions for every difficult case." David's jaw tightened, but he refused to back down. "He's not a case. He's my partner," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I made a mistake leaving him here. I thought I was doing what was right, but I was wrong. Don't make me pay for that mistake with his life." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of David's words hanging heavy in the air. Margaret sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I'll need proof that you can take care of him. Vet records, a plan for his medical needs, and paperwork showing you're able to take responsibility." She glanced at Lisa. "And it all needs to be in order by the end of the day. No exceptions." David nodded sharply, his determination unwavering. "You'll have it," he promised, already stepping out the door to begin the race against time. As David rushed out to gather the documents, Lisa lingered in the office, her heart pounding. She had bought them a few precious hours, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow's fate was still hanging by a thread. Would David's efforts be enough? Or would bureaucracy and time conspire to steal away Shadow's second chance? David rushed out of the shelter into the cold rain, his heart pounding as he raced to his car. Shadow's life depended on him, and Margaret's list of demands played on repeat in his head. Vet records, proof of care, and a plan. He tore through the glove compartment and found Shadow's old service records. A worn file filled with mission reports and medical notes from his K-9 days. It wasn't everything Margaret asked for, but it was a start. Clutching the folder, David jumped into the car and sped toward his next stop. The local vet clinic was quiet when David burst through the door, his urgency startling the receptionist. "I need Shadow's medical records," he said, his voice sharp. "He's a retired K-9. She hesitated, glancing at her computer. "That's from years ago. It'll take time to find those files." David leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "This is life or death." Reluctantly, the receptionist disappeared into the back. Minutes ticked by painfully before she returned with a thin file. "This is all we have," she said. David nodded quickly, muttering his thanks before running back to his car. At home, David worked frantically to make his apartment suitable for Shadow. He cleared clutter, shoved old boxes into corners, and laid out a blanket near the heater. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer right now. As he worked, guilt gnawed at him. Shadow had been there for him through everything, loyal, protective, and brave. And when Shadow needed him most, David had failed. He paused for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter. "Not this time," he whispered, forcing himself to keep moving. By the time David returned to the shelter, the sky had turned dark, and the parking lot was nearly empty. Lisa met him at the door, her expression tight with concern. "Did you get everything?" she asked. David handed over the documents, his hands shaking. "It's all here," he said. Lisa quickly scanned the files. "Okay, I'll take these to Margaret." "Wait here," she said, disappearing down the hallway. David sat heavily in a chair, staring at the clock. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, every tick louder than the last. When Lisa finally returned, her face was unreadable. She held the papers in her hand, hesitating before she spoke. "Margaret made her decision," she said softly. David's stomach sank, his breath catching in his chest. He braced himself, every second feeling like a lifetime. Would David's efforts be enough to save Shadow, or had time run out for his loyal partner? David's breath caught as Lisa stepped closer, holding the papers tightly. She avoided his gaze for a moment, her silence stretching unbearably. "Margaret has agreed," Lisa finally said, her voice cautious. "But there's a condition." Relief flooded David's chest, but it was quickly replaced by apprehension. "What condition?" he asked. Lisa exhaled, glancing over her shoulder as if to ensure they were alone. "Shadow has to be evaluated by a vet first. Margaret wants proof that he's not suffering. She won't allow him to leave if his condition is untreatable." David stiffened, his relief evaporating. Shadow was old and had been through years of grueling service. He couldn't deny the toll it had taken on his partner. "How soon can we do this?" he asked, determination sharpening his voice. "Tomorrow morning," Lisa replied. Margaret booked the shelter's vet to come in first thing. David nodded, though his heart sank at the delay. Shadow didn't have the luxury of waiting, but as much as the thought of another night in that cage hurt, David knew he had no choice. Later that evening, David visited Shadow's cage. The German shepherd perked up slightly, his tail giving a weak thump against the floor. "Hey, buddy," David said softly, kneeling in front of the bars. Shadow pressed his nose against the metal, letting out a low whine. "I'm not giving up on you," David promised, his voice thick with emotion. "You've saved me more times than I can count. It's my turn now." Shadow licked David's hand, his eyes reflecting a mixture of weariness and trust. As the hours passed, David remained at the shelter, too restless to leave. He wandered the halls, the distant barks of other dogs blending into the hum of his thoughts. Shadow's evaluation would decide everything. What if the vet determined he was beyond saving? What if David's efforts had all been in vain? The uncertainty gnawed at him, each passing minute a fresh wave of doubt. He found himself back at Shadow's cage, watching his partner sleep fitfully on the cold concrete floor. Morning came too quickly. David stood by anxiously as the shelter's vet arrived, carrying a bag of tools and a clipboard. Margaret supervised from a distance, her expression unreadable. The vet entered Shadow's cage and began the examination, his movements calm and methodical. David watched every detail, his hands clenched into fists. Finally, the vet straightened, his face thoughtful as he turned toward Margaret. "He's old," the vet said, "but his condition is manageable with proper care. I see no reason to put him down." David's heart leapt at the news, but Margaret remained quiet, her sharp gaze shifting between the vet, David, and Shadow. Would she honor the decision, or would Shadow's fate still hang in the balance? David's pulse quickened as the vet's words hung in the air. His condition is manageable. Relief washed over him, but the tension in the room remained thick. Margaret crossed her arms, her expression as stern as ever. "Even if the vet says he's fit," she said, her tone sharp, "we need to be absolutely certain you can handle this, Mr. Connors. Shadow's care won't be easy." Her gaze pierced through him, unyielding. "Can you provide what he needs? Or will he end up back here?" David straightened, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to spill over. "I can. I know I let him down once, but I won't let it happen again." His words carried the weight of his guilt, but also his resolve. "Shadow saved lives. He saved my life more times than I can count. I owe him this." Margaret held his gaze for a long moment before nodding slightly. "Fine," she said curtly. "We'll finalize the release paperwork, but there's one condition. You'll need to bring him back for regular check-ins." Lisa, who had been standing quietly by the door, let out a quiet sigh of relief. "I can help with the process," she offered, glancing at David with a small, encouraging smile. Margaret nodded but didn't soften. "I'll hold you accountable for his care," she said to David. "This isn't just about Shadow. It's about making sure these animals don't get let down again." Her words stung, but David understood her point. Shadow deserved nothing less than his full commitment. When the papers were finally signed, David was allowed into Shadow's cage for the first time. The German Shepherd rose unsteadily, his tail wagging faintly as David knelt down to embrace him. "We're going home, buddy," David whispered, his voice thick. Shadow nuzzled against him, a low, contented whine escaping his throat. Lisa watched from a distance, her own eyes glassy with emotion. For the first time in weeks, Shadow's cage no longer felt like a prison. It felt like the starting point of a second chance. As David walked Shadow out of the shelter, the crisp morning air filled his lungs, and for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. Shadow limped slightly, his age and wear evident, but he walked beside David with the quiet dignity of a warrior who had earned his rest. Margaret watched from the doorway, her arms still crossed, but her expression softened ever so slightly. "Don't make me regret this," she called after them. David turned, nodding firmly. "You won't." As they left the shelter behind, David felt the weight of responsibility settle on him, but it was a burden he was ready to carry. Shadow was finally free, but the challenges ahead were far from over. Could David truly provide the life Shadow deserved? Or would their new beginning bring obstacles neither of them expected? David carefully helped Shadow into the car, his hands steady as he guided the old dog onto the back seat. Shadow moved slowly, his joints stiff from years of wear, but his tail wagged faintly. David placed a blanket beneath him, speaking softly, "We'll get through this, buddy." One step at a time, Shadow's amber eyes met his, and in that moment, David felt the connection they had shared during their years as partners reignite. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a promise. The drive home was quiet, the weight of the morning still heavy in David's mind. As they passed familiar landmarks, memories surfaced. Nights patrolling the city together, moments when Shadow's instincts had saved lives. David glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing Shadow resting his head on the edge of the seat. Despite the exhaustion etched into his frame, there was a calmness about him, a sense of trust that made David's chest tighten. "We'll make it right," David whispered, gripping the steering wheel. Back at the apartment, David carried Shadow inside, his muscles straining under the dog's weight. Shadow sniffed the air cautiously, his nose twitching as he adjusted to the unfamiliar space. David had prepared a corner with a soft blanket and a bowl of water. "It's not much," he said, crouching down beside him, "but it's yours." Shadow settled onto the blanket with a heavy sigh, his body relaxing for the first time in days. David sat beside him, running his hand over Shadow's fur, and for a moment, the world felt still. The reality of Shadow's care began to set in almost immediately. David examined the list of medications the vet had prescribed, noting the costs. He'd need to adjust his budget, perhaps pick up extra work, but it didn't matter. Shadow deserved it. He made a mental checklist of appointments and exercises to help Shadow regain his strength, determined to give him the life he had earned. Despite the challenges, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. Shadow had been there for him through everything. Now it was his turn to do the same. As night fell, David sat on the floor beside Shadow's bed, his hand resting on the dog's side as they both drifted to sleep. The quiet apartment felt less lonely now, filled with a warmth that David hadn't felt in years. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Shadow's health was fragile, and their bond would be tested in ways neither of them could foresee. Yet, as David listened to Shadow's steady breathing, he knew one thing for certain. They would face it together. Shadow was safe, but the challenges of his recovery were only beginning. Could David keep his promise? Or would the strain of their new life bring unexpected struggles? The first morning in David's apartment brought a mix of hope and reality. Shadow's stiff movements were a stark reminder of the toll his body had endured over the years. David knelt beside him, carefully helping the German shepherd rise from his blanket. "Take it slow, buddy," he murmured, his hand steadying Shadow as the dog's legs trembled slightly. Shadow managed to stand, his tail giving a faint wag. Despite his age and injuries, the determination in his eyes was unmistakable. David had mapped out their day, beginning with a short walk around the block. The air was crisp, and the ground was still damp from the rain the night before. Shadow moved cautiously, his gait uneven but steady. Neighbors paused to watch the pair, some smiling warmly, others curious about the aging dog. David felt a small sense of pride as Shadow sniffed the air, his ears perking slightly at the distant sound of children playing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The vet's instructions weighed heavily on David's mind as he prepared Shadow's meals and administered his medication. Every pill, every carefully measured portion of food, was a reminder of the fragile balance Shadow's health required. David couldn't help but worry about the mounting costs. His savings were limited, and while he had some freelance work lined up, it might not be enough. "One thing at a time," he told himself, rubbing Shadow's head as the dog ate slowly. Shadow glanced up, his eyes filled with trust, and David felt his resolve strengthen. Later that afternoon, David set up a small exercise routine in the living room. Using a ball and some treats, he encouraged Shadow to stretch and move. At first, Shadow seemed unsure, his movements hesitant. But as they continued, a flicker of his old self emerged. He pawed at the ball, nudging it toward David, his tail wagging more confidently. "That's it," David said, grinning. "You've still got it." The sight of Shadow engaging, even in small ways, filled David with hope. As night fell, Shadow curled up on his blanket, his breathing steady and calm. David sat nearby, reflecting on the day. It had been challenging, and the road ahead would undoubtedly test them both. But for the first time in years, David felt a sense of purpose. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a reminder of loyalty, resilience, and second chances. "We're in this together," David whispered, leaning back against the wall. Shadow opened one eye briefly before settling back into sleep. The small victories brought hope, but the challenges of Shadow's recovery were far from over. Would David be able to sustain the care Shadow needed? Or would unforeseen obstacles test their bond further? The following days brought a fragile sense of routine. Shadow's walks grew slightly longer, and his appetite improved with each carefully prepared meal. David clung to these small victories, drawing strength from Shadow's steady progress. But just as things seemed to stabilize, the first setback arrived without warning. One morning, Shadow struggled to rise from his bed, his legs trembling more than usual. A sharp yelp escaped his throat when he tried to take a step. David's heart sank as he rushed to his side. "Easy, boy," he said softly, kneeling to support him. Shadow's eyes met his, filled with pain and confusion. The trip to the vet felt heavier this time. Shadow lay quietly in the back seat, his head resting on the edge of the seat. His usual spark dimmed. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel as worry gnawed at him. At the clinic, the vet conducted a thorough examination, pressing gently along Shadow's joints and observing his movements. "It's not uncommon for older dogs to experience flare-ups," the vet explained. "His arthritis is progressing. We can adjust his medication, but his activity will need to be limited for a while." David nodded, absorbing the advice, but the weight of Shadow's condition pressed heavily on his chest. Back home, David adjusted Shadow's routine to accommodate his setback. The short walks became even shorter, and playtime was replaced with gentle stretches. David watched Shadow closely, noting every wince or hesitation. Despite the pain, Shadow's spirit remained steady. He still greeted David with a wagging tail and leaned into his touch during quiet moments. "You're a fighter," David said one evening as he sat beside Shadow, his hand resting on the dog's head. "We'll get through this. Promise." But as days turned into weeks, the financial strain began to take its toll. Shadow's new medication was expensive, and the additional vet visits ate into David's savings. He took on extra freelance work, spending late nights at his computer while Shadow dozed nearby. The exhaustion crept in, but David pushed through, driven by the loyalty he felt toward his old partner. Yet, in quiet moments, doubt lingered. Could he truly sustain this? What if he wasn't enough for Shadow? One night, as David worked late, a knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Lisa standing there, holding a bag of supplies. "I thought you might need some help," she said with a small smile. David was taken aback but grateful as Lisa stepped inside, her presence easing some of the weight on his shoulders. As they talked, Lisa shared stories of other dogs she'd seen recover and encouraged David not to lose hope. For the first time in days, David felt a spark of reassurance. Lisa's arrival brought unexpected support, but Shadow's condition remained precarious. Could their combined efforts be enough to pull him through, or would the challenges ahead prove too great to overcome? Lisa's presence became a lifeline for David and Shadow. She visited regularly, bringing supplies, advice, and an unwavering optimism that David hadn't realized he needed. One evening, as they sat on the floor with Shadow lying between them, Lisa gently ran her hand over the dog's gray fur. "He's still got fight in him," she said, her voice soft. "I've seen dogs bounce back from worse. But he needs you to believe in him as much as he believes in you." Her words lingered in David's mind long after she left, stirring a resolve that had wavered in the face of mounting challenges. Despite their best efforts, Shadow's condition took another downturn. One morning, David found him lying still, his breathing shallow and labored. Panic surged as David knelt beside him, whispering words of encouragement. Shadow opened his eyes briefly, the trust in his gaze cutting straight to David's heart. He called the vet immediately, his voice trembling. "He's not doing well," David said. "I need help." The vet agreed to see Shadow that afternoon, but David couldn't shake the dread creeping in as he watched his partner struggle. At the clinic, the vet delivered a sobering update. "His age and arthritis are catching up to him," she said, her tone cautious but kind. "But he's not giving up, and neither should you. Let's adjust his treatment and focus on his comfort." David nodded, clinging to her words. As he led Shadow back to the car, he couldn't ignore the heaviness in his chest. Shadow still wagged his tail faintly, and that small gesture was enough to keep David moving forward. Back home, David sat with Shadow in the quiet of the evening, the soft hum of the heater filling the space. "You've always been stronger than me," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "You never gave up, even when I let you down. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Shadow shifted slightly, resting his head on David's lap, and David felt tears welling in his eyes. In that moment, he made a decision. No matter what the future held, he would stand by Shadow's side until the very end. Over the next few weeks, small victories began to emerge. Shadow's new treatment eased his pain, and his appetite returned. David adjusted their routine once more, celebrating every step forward, no matter how small. Lisa continued to visit, her encouragement keeping David grounded. The bond between man and dog deepened, forged in their shared struggle. As David watched Shadow rest peacefully one evening, he realized something profound. Shadow wasn't just fighting for himself. He was teaching David what it truly meant to endure. Shadow's journey was far from over, but David had found strength in their shared battle. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, one step at a time. The life Shadow had left might be uncertain, but it would be filled with love, loyalty, and a partnership that refused to break.